For 40 years, nobody has known his real story. The sign-in sheet just says, Hayes. He looks like any ordinary retiree, but his shooting style. This isn't just a hobby. This is a skill developed for survival. So who is this man? Before we continue this incredible story, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. The morning light filtered through the industrial windows of Precision Firearms Training Center, casting long shadows across empty shooting lanes. Most people wouldn't arrive for another hour, but Thomas had been coming here since before dawn for nearly a decade. He preferred the solitude, the quiet moments before the day filled with chatter and competition. Nobody really knew much about the elderly gentleman who occupied Lane 12 every Tuesday and Friday morning. The staff had grown accustomed to his routine, arriving precisely at 6:30, signing in with just his surname, Hayes, and methodically setting up his equipment with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Thomas wore clothes that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. His denim shirt, softened by countless washings, rolled neatly to reveal weathered forearms marked by decades of manual work. His baseball cap, once navy blue but now faded to an indeterminate gray, sat squarely on his head with no logos or declarations. Everything about his appearance suggested an ordinary retiree filling his days with a hobby. The younger shooters who frequented the range during busier hours had their theories about the quiet man. Some thought he might be a former factory worker enjoying his pension. Others assumed he was just another gun enthusiast with time to kill. They noticed his conservative ammunition use, never more than 40 rounds per session, and his methodical approach to cleanup. He seemed unremarkable in every way, except for one thing: his shooting was absolutely flawless. On this particular morning, the range began filling earlier than usual. A group of military personnel on leave had decided to spend their free time practicing their marksmanship. Among them was Corporal Marcus Washington, a Marine fresh from his second deployment in Afghanistan. Marcus had earned recognition as one of the finest marksmen in his unit, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from proven ability under pressure. The Marines set up several lanes away from Thomas, their conversation filled with the easy camaraderie of soldiers sharing stories and friendly competition. They were focused on their own activities, paying little attention to the solitary figure methodically working through his routine nearby. Marcus was halfway through his second magazine when something caught his attention. Not a sound exactly, but a rhythm. While his fellow Marines were firing in the typical pattern of practice sessions, rapid strings followed by pauses for target assessment, there was another cadence underlying the general noise. Steady, deliberate, almost meditative in its consistency. Curiosity getting the better of him, Marcus glanced toward the source of the measured firing. The older man's stance was textbook perfect, his grip unwavering, his follow-through precise. But it was more than technique that caught Marcus's eye. There was something in the way the man moved that spoke of deep, ingrained training, the kind that becomes second nature only after years of intensive practice and real-world application. During a break in his own shooting, Marcus walked closer to observe. The target Thomas was using showed a grouping so tight it could have been drawn with a compass. Every shot had found its mark within a circle no larger than a silver dollar. This wasn't recreational shooting. This was the work of someone who had once depended on such precision for survival. As Thomas paused to reload, Marcus noticed something that made his breath catch. Visible beneath the rolled sleeve of the older man's shirt was a tattoo, faded but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. It wasn't the elaborate artwork popular among today's military personnel, but something simpler and more meaningful, the kind of marking that told a story only certain people would understand. Marcus recognized the symbol immediately. It was the emblem of a reconnaissance unit, specifically one that had operated during some of the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam conflict. This wasn't something you got on a whim or because you thought it looked impressive. You earned it through actions that most people couldn't imagine, in places that didn't officially exist. The young Marine found himself in an unexpected position. Protocol suggested he should approach with respect, but the older man's demeanor clearly indicated someone who preferred to be left alone. Marcus decided to wait, watching as Thomas completed his session with the same methodical precision he had observed earlier. When Thomas finally set down his weapon and began the careful process of cleaning it, Marcus made his decision. He approached slowly, mindfully, in the way one approaches a figure of respect. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus kept his voice low, respectful. "I couldn't help but notice your shooting. It's exceptional." Thomas looked up from his cleaning routine, his eyes taking in Marcus's bearing, his haircut, the way he carried himself. The assessment was quick but thorough, the evaluation of someone accustomed to reading people in situations where the wrong judgment could prove fatal. "Just staying sharp," Thomas replied simply, returning his attention to his weapon. Marcus hesitated, then decided to continue. "That ink on your arm, sir, that's first recon, isn't it?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas stopped his cleaning motion, his hands still for just a moment, before continuing with his task. When he finally looked up again, his expression was unreadable. "Long time ago," he said quietly. Those 3 words carried more weight than an hour of conversation might have. Marcus understood that he was standing in the presence of someone who had served in ways that most people would never fully comprehend. The reconnaissance units of that era had operated behind enemy lines, often for weeks at a time, with no support and no backup except what they carried with them. "Vietnam?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Thomas nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that confirmed what Marcus had suspected. "Cambodia, too. Laos, places that weren't supposed to exist on any map." The casual mention of locations that had been classified for decades sent a chill down Marcus's spine. These were the operations that had been conducted in complete secrecy, missions where success was measured not by glory or recognition, but by how many of your team made it home alive. Marcus found himself at a loss for words. He had served with honor in Afghanistan, had faced danger, and performed well under pressure, but he was beginning to understand that he was in the presence of someone who had operated on an entirely different level, the kind of soldier who had helped define what modern special operations would become. "How long were you over there?" Marcus asked. 3 tours, 68 to 73. Thomas's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than some of the most intense combat operations in American military history. Marcus did quick mental math. Those years covered some of the heaviest fighting of the entire conflict, including operations that wouldn't be declassified for decades. The reconnaissance teams of that era had suffered casualty rates that were staggering, yet somehow this quiet man had not only survived but had done so for multiple deployments. "I've heard stories about those missions," Marcus said carefully. "Deep insertion, weeks behind enemy lines." Thomas's expression softened slightly, not with warmth exactly, but with the recognition that he was speaking to someone who might actually understand the realities of what military service could entail. "We did what was asked of us," he said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." The understated response was typical of his generation of warriors, Marcus realized. They didn't seek recognition or glory. They had simply done their duty in circumstances that would have broken lesser men, then came home and resumed their lives without fanfare or expectation of special treatment. By now, Marcus's fellow Marines had noticed his extended absence and wandered over to see what had captured his attention. They approached with the casual curiosity of soldiers, but their demeanor shifted quickly when Marcus quietly explained who they were meeting. The introductions that followed were respectful, but subdued. These young Marines, confident in their own abilities and proud of their service, found themselves in the presence of someone who represented a different era of warfare entirely. Thomas accepted their respect with quiet dignity, neither dismissing their acknowledgement nor seeking to expand upon it. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Thomas had no interest in war stories or detailed recounting of his experiences. When asked about specific operations or encounters, he deflected gently but firmly. "Those stories belong to the people who didn't make it home," he said at one point, effectively ending that line of inquiry. Instead, he seemed more interested in the young Marines themselves, their training, their experiences, their plans for the future. He asked thoughtful questions about modern equipment and tactics, displaying a keen interest in how military operations had evolved since his time in service. The fundamentals never change, he observed after listening to descriptions of current training protocols. Equipment gets better, communications improve, but at the end of the day, it still comes down to the person behind the rifle. As if to emphasize his point, Thomas returned to his shooting, this time with an audience. The Marines watched in respectful silence as he demonstrated the kind of marksmanship that had kept him alive in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Every shot was deliberate, controlled, precise. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary adjustments, just the smooth, practiced execution of skills honed under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. When he finished his final magazine, Thomas began his cleanup routine with the same methodical approach he applied to everything else. The Marines helped without being asked, understanding instinctively that they were being given a privilege not often extended to others. As Thomas prepared to leave, Marcus felt compelled to express what they were all feeling. "Sir, thank you for your service and for sharing your time with us today." Thomas paused in his packing, considering the young man's words. "You boys are the ones doing the serving now," he said finally. "I had my turn. Make sure you take care of each other out there." The simple statement carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. These weren't empty words or platitudes, but advice from someone who had learned its importance in the most unforgiving classroom possible. After Thomas left, the Marines found themselves subdued, each processing the encounter in his own way. They had come to the range expecting a routine practice session, and instead had met a living piece of military history. Someone who had helped write the book on special operations warfare, yet carried himself with the quiet humility of any ordinary citizen. Over the following weeks, word spread quietly among the military personnel who frequented the range. They began arriving earlier, hoping to overlap with Thomas's sessions, not to bother him or pepper him with questions, but simply to observe and learn. There was something profoundly educational about watching someone work who had mastered his craft under the most demanding conditions possible. Thomas seemed to understand what was happening, but never acknowledged it directly. He continued his routine unchanged, methodical, and precise as always. But those who watched carefully noticed that he occasionally provided subtle instruction, a slight adjustment in stance demonstrated rather than described, a breathing technique modeled rather than explained. The range staff, longtime observers of the shooting community, recognized what was developing. Lane 12 became informally reserved during Thomas's sessions, not through any official policy, but through an unspoken understanding among the regulars. This wasn't about celebrity or showmanship. It was about respect for someone who had earned it through service and sacrifice. Months passed and the quiet education continued. Young soldiers learned not just about shooting technique, but about bearing, about the quiet confidence that comes from proven competence, about the humility that true professionals display. Thomas never claimed to be teaching anyone anything, but his presence alone provided lessons that couldn't be found in any manual. One day, Marcus approached Thomas with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Sir, why do you still come here? Why keep practicing?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "Because the moment you stop training is the moment you start forgetting. And forgetting means someone else might have to pay the price." The response encapsulated everything Marcus had come to understand about the older man. Even decades after his active service had ended, Thomas maintained his skills not for personal satisfaction or hobby, but from a sense of responsibility. A recognition that expertise, once gained, carries with it an obligation to preserve and maintain that capability. As time went on, Thomas began to open up slightly about his experiences, though always in general terms and always with the focus on lessons rather than personal glory. He spoke about the importance of preparation, the value of steady nerves under pressure, the critical nature of trusting your teammates completely. "Fear is normal," he told a group of young Marines one morning. The question isn't whether you'll be afraid, but what you'll do with that fear. Will you let it control you, or will you use it to stay alert and focused? These conversations, informal and infrequent as they were, became treasured by those fortunate enough to participate. Here was someone who had faced the ultimate test of military service and emerged not just intact, but with wisdom that could benefit the next generation of warriors. The transformation in the range's atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. The usual bravado and competition that characterized many shooting environments gave way to something more focused and respectful. People paid closer attention to their fundamentals, took their practice more seriously, treated their equipment with greater care. Thomas's influence extended beyond technical instruction. His quiet professionalism, his understated confidence, his complete lack of ego, despite his obvious expertise, all of these qualities provided a model of how a true professional conducts himself. The young servicemen who spent time around him began to carry themselves differently, to approach their own duties with greater seriousness and humility. Years passed, and Thomas continued his routine, unchanged and unchanging. New groups of military personnel cycled through the range, each discovering for themselves the quiet teacher who occupied Lane 12. Some learned of his background through others, some figured it out through observation and careful questioning. All came away with a deeper appreciation for the standards of excellence that true professionals maintain. The legacy Thomas created wasn't written in official records or captured in photographs. It lived in the improved performance of the soldiers he influenced, in the higher standards they maintained, in the professionalism they displayed in their own service. His teaching was done through example rather than instruction, through presence rather than proclamation. When people asked Thomas about his impact on the younger generation of warriors, he typically deflected the question. "They're good people," he would say simply. "They just needed to see what right looked like." This modest assessment missed the profound truth of what he had accomplished. In a culture often obsessed with recognition and publicity, Thomas had demonstrated the power of quiet excellence. He had shown that true professionals don't need to advertise their competence, they simply display it through their actions, day after day, year after year. The story of Thomas in Lane 12 became part of the unofficial lore of the shooting community. Not because anyone sought to publicize it, but because the example it provided was too valuable to be forgotten. In a world where military service is often either glorified or politicized, Thomas represented something pure, the simple dedication of a professional who continued to serve in his own way long after his official duty had ended. His presence reminded everyone who encountered him that true heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about maintaining standards, preserving knowledge, and passing on wisdom to those who will carry the burden of service in the future. It's about understanding that excellence is not a destination, but a daily choice, made quietly and consistently, whether anyone is watching or not. In the end, Thomas's greatest lesson wasn't about marksmanship or military tactics. It was about character, the importance of carrying yourself with dignity, of serving without seeking recognition, of maintaining your standards regardless of circumstances. These lessons, learned in the informal classroom of Lane 12, would serve his students well beyond their military careers, shaping them into better leaders, better citizens, and better human beings. The quiet teacher continued his routine, unchanged and unassuming, a living reminder that sometimes the most profound education comes not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who demonstrate excellence through their actions, one carefully placed shot at a time. Thomas never sought recognition for the influence he wielded at the range. He would have been surprised to learn how many young servicemen carried his lessons with them into combat zones around the world. His teachings about precision, discipline, and quiet professionalism became part of their operational philosophy, passed down through informal networks of mentorship and shared experience. The ripple effects of his presence extended far beyond the confines of Lane 12. Former students, now senior non-commissioned officers and commissioned leaders, found themselves unconsciously modeling the same understated excellence they had observed in their elderly instructor. They emphasized fundamentals over flashiness, substance over style, character over charisma. In retirement centers and veterans organizations across the country, similar quiet heroes maintained their own routines, their own commitment to excellence. They represented a generation that understood service not as a temporary obligation, but as a lifelong calling. Men and women who had learned that true strength comes not from what you demand of others, but from what you demand of yourself. Thomas remained unaware of the broader significance of his simple Friday morning routine. To him, it was simply what professionals do. They maintain their edge, preserve their skills, and remain ready to contribute however they can. He embodied the timeless truth that excellence is not an event but a habit, practiced daily in small ways that accumulate into something profound and lasting.